Welcome everybody to today's Studium Generale of the TU Delft lunch lecture. I'm your host, Klaas van der Tempel. I'm a program maker at SG. And we're all together today joined with our speaker, Hugh Aldersey-Williams, to find out more about a historical figure of the Netherlands. It's going to be a biographical lecture. There will also be a chance for questions and answers at the end. There are a lot of people here today, so I'd ask you, if you do have questions, post them in the chat, and then I will ask them on your behalf. Please note also that this lecture is being recorded. Don't worry about your privacy. No names, no video feeds are going to be shared online. And hopefully it'll be available on our YouTube channel in a week or two, so you can share it with other people if you enjoyed this today. I would like to turn now to our guest, Hugh Aldersey-Williams, a journalist and an author, both British and American. He's written a book, which hopefully some of you have read. I have just finished reading the last pages this morning because it is a large book, 600 pages, detailing, as I said, Christiaan Huygens, a great in the history of science of the Netherlands, but also of the world. There is a lot to talk about in this history. We're not going to get to everything, of course. Hopefully he will have some interesting tidbits and highlights to tell us. I want to start him off with a simple question, which is, Hugh, could you introduce yourself briefly and also why you wrote this book?
Well, I'm essentially a science writer, but I've always been interested in broader cultural things, design and architecture and art and so on. And so I tend to look for subjects who embrace that wider world, and almost anybody in the Dutch Golden Age is going to be doing that. This is a time when science isn't the sort of furrowed sort of profession that it has later become, where you sort of do science and are perceived to do nothing else. My subject's interests were very broad at a time when most people had broad interests and did many things. So I'm attracted to people like that, polymaths like Huygens. And I was inspired by a book that was very successful here a few years ago on a biography of Alexander von Humboldt. And this suggested that a rule, a sort of unwritten rule in British publishing had been broken, that at last possibly you could write about someone who wasn't British. And that if you were going to write a scientific biography, it didn't have to be about Darwin or Newton. It could be about someone else. And Huygens struck me as an interesting subject for both of those reasons.
Can you tell us a bit about what your first contact or your first encounter was with Christiaan Huygens?
Well, I honestly can't reliably remember. I mean, I did read that book about von Humboldt, and I thought, are there other characters like that out there? I'm very interested in the 17th century. I'd written a previous book about an English physician and philosopher writer called Sir Thomas Browne, who actually studied in Leiden, studied medicine, anatomy there briefly, and came back to live in Norwich, which is near where I live. And this period is one where science is just taking shape. The word science actually means something else, rather. The word scientist didn't exist, but people are beginning to realize that experiments tell you things, and if you design the right experiment and perform it properly enough, you'll gain some new information. So that was kind of my starting point.
Well, as you may know, Christiaan Huygens, he lived in The Hague most of his life in the Netherlands. We're the University of Technology of Delft, but we actually have a bust of Christiaan Huygens in front of the Faculty of Mathematics and Computer Science. And of course, there's the eponymous study association named Christiaan Huygens as well. So we do feel connected to him. And I'd like to ask you to start. And I'm really curious where you're even going to begin in the story of his life. There's a lot to choose from.
I think it's important to begin with his father. That English person I mentioned just now, Sir Thomas Browne, sort of falls in between Christian and his father, Constantine. And as I said, this is a time where people are just beginning to learn to do experiments. Constantine Habens was, and he's the more famous Huygens, I think, in Holland, and the Huygens struts and the Huygens schools and things that you see are usually intended to be named after him. He was important as a secretary to the House of Orange and the Council of State at that time. He was part of what became a dynasty of Huygenses who served the House of Orange in various sort of diplomatic functions. His father had done so, and he carried on for Frederick Hendrik and Willem II, and all during the 80 Years' War and for long after. The three generations of Huygenses served in that capacity. So that was Constantine, the father's day job, but he had many interests, as I was saying. This is kind of characteristic of the period, and certainly for someone with wealth and connections, you could pursue these things, and he had the talent as well. So Constantine was a composer, and there are some of his works that exist, and he was a very active musician. He was mainly a poet and wrote many verses, thousands of them, very short ones. Sometimes when he was out on campaign during the 80 Years' War, sometimes he even wrote short verses on horseback. They were that short, and great long ones too. Important verses about the Hague of his youth, and about the Hofwijk house as a sort of ideal garden, house and garden estate, and so on. So he had many accomplishments and many interests, and serious interests. So he was, I've kind of picked up on this Dutch term, kenner. He was a kenner of these arts rather than a mere enthusiast or a liefhebber. He really delved into the subjects that he chose and learned much about them, and therefore became quite an expert. So in order to learn about art, you had to not just sort of look at it, but you had to be able to do it, and to paint for yourself, and then you understand much more deeply and intuitively what's going on. And then that knowledge put him in a position, for example, he sort of discovered, slight exaggeration to say discovered, but he discovered Rembrandt and Lievens, and was responsible for giving them some of their important early jobs. So he was a kenner of art, painting, also of architecture, and he was very actively involved in the design of the house in which he lived in The Hague, which once stood next to the Maritz House, sadly demolished in the 19th century, and also of Hofwijk, his out-of-town house, a few kilometers out of town on the Fleet Canal. Very different style of houses, both of those, but only the Hofwijk survives. And so painting, architecture, also science. He was interested in science. He was curious about how things worked, but he wasn't really equipped to perform experiments, to design experiments and carry them through. But nevertheless, he was very curious about how things worked, and he associated with scientists on an early visit to London in his sort of junior diplomatic capacity in the 1620s. He met Francis Bacon, for example. He met Cornelis Drebbel, the Dutch-born, but then living in London, pioneer of the submarine, and many other crazy and wonderful inventions. And Constantine learned something about lens grinding for telescopes and so on from him, it's thought. And then a few years later, he's working with Descartes, helping Descartes in his attempt to grind a hyperbolic lens, which it was thought by many at the time would eliminate aberration in images that you see looking through telescopes. It was a failed experiment because they didn't really know what they were doing and they were sort of barking up the wrong tree. But nevertheless, they made several sort of determined attempts to sort of combine the right mathematics of the curve shape of the lens they wanted and get a maker to fabricate it for them and then try it out optically to see if it worked. He also got 1650s this is, so this is throughout decades of his life. It's a sustained interest. He became fell into correspondence with Margaret Cavendish, who's a remarkable figure in sort of philosophy of the time. She's a prototype science fiction writer and had strong ideas about women's participation in philosophical and scientific life, and was dressed very colourfully and became a very sort of controversial, larger-than-life figure. And Huygens engaged in correspondence with her, and they corresponded about these phenomena called Prince Rupert's drops, or Batavsetranen, Dutch tears. And these were little glass beads that were shaped like a kind of a sort of tadpole shape that had the very curious property that if you hit them hard with a hammer on the bulbous end, on the head end, if you like, nothing would happen. They would be apparently indestructible. But then if you very gently snipped off the tail end of these strange little glass baubles, the whole thing would explode, and you have to, quite violently, you'd have to protect your eyes and make sure you didn't injure yourself. And people were puzzled as to why this happened. And these, in the 1650s, these things traveled the courts of Europe with people becoming curious about them. And so Huygens and Margaret Cavendish tossed theories around as to what might be going on. Again, they weren't equipped to do the experiments properly. They didn't really know what they were looking at or measuring. And so their speculations were not all that accurate. And other people like Robert Hooke in particular came much closer to solving the problem of what they were looking at, which was essentially the glass is sort of formed in a pre-stressed way so that it will be very strong in some ways. But if you leave the tension by breaking off the tip of the droplet, it explodes. So that's Constantine, and he's there for the whole of Christian's life almost. Constantine lives to the age of 91 and dies in 1687, and Constantine dies only in 1695. So he's a very I don't like to say controlling presence, because he let Christian pursue his scientific life he clearly wanted to pursue, and in fact enabled him to do so, and obviously funded him and furnished connections and so on. But he was a very guiding presence, let's say, quite a mentor as well as a father, as I say, for his whole life. And Constantine sort of regarded all his sons and his one daughter in much the same way, and so they formed a kind of informal network that stretched here and there across Europe at different points, as one or other brother. Christian had three brothers. He had an older brother, Constantine, as well, confusingly, a middle brother called Ludwig, and a younger brother called Philips. And at various stages, these brothers went off to London, or to Italy, or to Madrid, or in Philips's case, he went to Malbork in Poland, and unfortunately caught an illness there and didn't come back. So these people were sort of Constantine the father's eyes and ears across Europe. And they too were scientifically literate, shall we say, useful, able to be useful to Christiaan, who was either in The Hague or later in Paris doing his scientific things. But when they were in a position to talk to an astronomer in Danzig or some scientist in Florence or somewhere, they would be able to come back with information that was useful to Christiaan, the sort of professional scientist almost.
You're describing sort of an informal network for science to develop in Europe at that time?
Well, I mean, the network then goes much wider because scientists are beginning to realize that it's a good idea to correspond with each other and to compare ideas between cities and countries. So, I mean, his brothers are able to help Christiaan, and in particular, Constantine, his older brother, helped in a practical sense with lens grinding. So together they would grind lenses, which was a very kind of tedious and challenging task for telescopes. But Lodewijk too would go here and there, and Phillips, and be able to send back information about what local astronomers and physicists and so on were doing. So they were, their own little family network, but then wider than that, there are, people who were members of salons and so on in Paris, where Christiaan settled, and what would become the Royal Society in Gresham College, and then the Royal Society in London, and similar, individuals in courts in other cities, in Prague and Copenhagen and places. So all these groups would, correspondence would become important between them all. Uh-oh. Have we lost connection?
No, we can still hear you.
Okay, good. So, and I mean, I'll talk about Christiaan in a minute, and about his internationalism, and obviously this Republic of Letters network of scientists, as they weren't yet called, became very important to him, and those enabled science to advance faster. And there are sort of practical examples of where that happens. So I wanted to talk about Christiaan, obviously, as the principal subject of my book. I do become distracted by Constantine the Father simply because he has so many interests and such accomplishments in so many fields. But Christiaan was much more focused and driven, I suppose you might say, and was essentially a kind of prototype of a professional scientist. I mean, people didn't have professions of that sort at that time, of course, but unlike many other people who were doing science and making various breakthroughs at the time, Christiaan was only doing that, and he wasn't diverting himself off into philosophical speculations or airing odd theories about religions and so on. So he was able to devote a lot of his time to scientific ideas, funded and enabled by his father and by the positions that he secured, which I'll talk about that in a second. So, I mean, his principal discoveries are astronomical, and he discovered the first moon of Saturn, which became known as Titan later on in 1665. And using a slightly improved telescope a year later, was able to discern the ring of Saturn and solve the puzzle of its shape, which had bothered astronomers for some decades. because with gradually improving telescopes since the invention of the telescope in the first decade of the 17th century, people had turned the devices to the planets, and they'd seen first moons of Jupiter, and they'd seen that Saturn had a kind of blurry mess around it that they couldn't resolve, couldn't make sense of, partly because the blurry mess kept changing, because as we know now, the ring tilts in different aspects towards us at different phases of the planets, our planets and the Earth's and Saturn's revolutions around the sun. So Huygens was able to solve this problem. He used a better telescope, could see it better, but more importantly, and this is a very Huygens-ish moment, I think, because he was so adept at mathematics and geometry in particular, I think he had the sort of, and physics and motion and the idea of bodies in motion. He realized that whatever it was around Saturn would have to have a symmetry that was, if you like, logical, that the physics would have to permit it. And so other people's ideas about what was around Saturn, like two very close moons, one on either side, wasn't really as attractive as the completely symmetrically disposed ring around the edge of the planet was. So it had a sort of fundamental mathematical purity to it when he suggested it, as well as being reliant on his better observations.
This mathematical purity, could you talk a bit more about that? Was that new for the time?
It wasn't new for the time if you were a mathematician, but Huygens was combining maths with the physics and with the observational astronomy, and that's bringing all that together, I think, was really special to him. And there's another moment where this is sort of characteristically important, which is a bit nuanced to discuss, and I kind of feel I should have made a model for this or something. But in the 1650s, his early kind of set of achievements, his main major invention is to devise an accurate pendulum clock, so one that will only vary by a few minutes in a day at most, rather than one that would slip for hours and would be pretty useless. And he was able to do this by studying the pendulum's swing and altering it so that obviously the pendulum swings in an arc of a circle. But if you make the pendulum swing too long, the length of the period of the swing changes, even though it sort of shouldn't, by the sort of simple mathematical rule of the thing. And so what Huygens did was to slightly shorten the swing at the end of its each way of its swing by putting two sort of little metal plates at the top of where the string of the pendulum swings from, and these sort of squeeze the swing when it reaches its outer range and shortens it, and therefore improve the period of the pendulum for all ranges of swinging, and therefore made a more accurate clock. And the precise curve of this little plate that Huygens was putting at the top of the pendulum swing point obviously interested him as a geometer and mathematician. And he discovered that it was a form called a cycloid. Oh, sorry, he got this wrong. I knew this would happen. So he discovered that the best form for the swing of the pendulum itself, once he'd made this adjustment, then became a cycloid. And from there, he then worked out, using geometrical mathematics, that the ideal form for the plates at the top of where the thing swings from was also a cycloid. And this was a kind of very exciting and strange discovery. I should say a cycloid is the curve you get when, if you imagine a wheel rolling along horizontal ground and there's a mark on the edge of the wheel, the rim of the wheel. The cycloid is the shape made as the wheel goes along. So it looks roughly like semicircles, but is not exactly semicircular, of course, and it's actually got a very complicated equation that they obviously wanted to discover and had great troubles arriving at that time. So it's this fusion of mathematics and the physics of motion, bodies in motion, and so on, and sometimes astronomy, what he sees through his telescope, that is kind of Huygens is unique. What he brings to this thing uniquely, I think, almost. So I should say, in addition to being a geometer, he also was a pioneer of probability studies, and so he travelled. I'll talk about his travels in a second, but he travelled to France and became acquainted with Fermat and Pascal, who were developing early ideas of probability. And Huygens came back to The Hague and wrote the first, essentially, probability textbook, all about the laws of chance in games of dice and various things. So that's kind of shows some of his mathematical range. Later, from the pendulum clock was, a sort of wall-sized device. But the same technology was also enlarged on clocks at Scheveningen church. He was able to improve the church clock there, and also in Utrecht. And then later, in the 1670s, so this is a couple of decades later, all of these activities are sort of pursued in parallel. So he's always doing astronomy, he's always doing physics, he's always working with innovations to do with clocks throughout his career, and sort of oscillates between these various activities and returns to them, leaves them for a bit, comes back. He devises a balance spring clock, which is an improved, he hopes it will be an improved form of pendulum clock. So it doesn't have a hanging pendulum, and the hope is that this will be useful for use aboard ships, where a hanging pendulum is obviously not very compatible with a ship rocking about, whereas this device was a little iron spiral spring that controlled the accuracy of the clock. It didn't drive the clock, but it's a device to control the accuracy of the clock. So this would be for use in sort of smaller chronometers and almost sort of handheld or desktop clocks, if you like. And Huygens became involved in a very bitter dispute with Robert Hooke, who, as soon as he heard about Huygens's announcement in 1675, said that, well, actually, a decade ago, he'd had the same idea, but oops, hadn't published it. And so they became embroiled in a rather ugly dispute. So those are sort of Huygens's big successful ideas, and there are, as with such a lively mind and as such an inventor, he's always thinking up ideas, and they're not always successful. And in fact, he was told off by his tutors as a boy and by his father for sort of making little mechanical toys all the time, which they could see no use in when he's meant to be learning his Latin or his rhetoric or whatever it was. But this very sort of practical habit was very much part of him. I think his father was afraid he might go into some artisanal trade, and that would be rather déclassé. So he wanted to avoid that at all costs. But nevertheless, Huygens kept on having ideas and becoming engaged in projects that required them. So he became involved in various sort of hydraulics projects to do with the design of fountains. he had a long correspondence with a French engineer who, together, they were trying to improve the ride on a sprung carriage. So if you're being drawn by a horse, that can be quite an uncomfortable experience, especially with the bumps in the road and so on. And so the wheel size and how the carriage is supported, where the carriage is supported on the sort of axis between the horse's back and the wheels is important. And they came up with some sort of very odd innovations where the carriage was sort of halfway between the horse and the wheels, which were miles away, miles behind you, and the horse was miles in front on great long planks, which, needless to say, didn't catch on. And actually, I think the ride was comfortable, but it was very bad for the horse's back. And he almost invented Nike Airs. So he had a sort of idea that if you put a sort of sprung base on the bottom of a shoe, it would lift you over the mud. And then he turned this same idea to the idea of ships. So this was when he was working in France, and some French ships had run aground off the islands of Curacao, actually when they were fighting the Dutch. And he thought that maybe that same technology could be fitted to the bottom of ships to lift them off if they ran aground, which again wasn't an idea that went very far. So I mean, that's just typical just to sort of show the range and fecundity of his thinking.
Hugh, can you attest to his drive as an inventor and scientist? Because the range from building your own telescope and studying Saturn to devising new shoes, that's really broad. What was his drive?
It's hard to know, I suppose. It's I mean, he didn't marry. He did have a social life, especially when he was in Paris. He complained that The Hague was very boring and quiet, but
it still is.
He went to balls and concerts and so on. He was, you know, like his father, he was a musician, and I haven't even had time to talk about the musical scale he invented, the microtonal musical scale. So he took part in the social life of the city. But he was curious, you know, he was interested in problems. I mean, people threw problems at him as well in France, especially, where he had this position, which I'll talk about in a sec. So that's really the answer. He had the equipment, he had the mechanical sensibility to think about making machines, even if he wasn't always the maker of them. He was, you know, a pointer, clockmaker or whatever. But he would make his own telescopes, or at least the lenses for them. So he was very hands-on in a way. So I ought to talk about a bit about his you know, where he actually did all these things. So his sort of miraculous time was 1655 and 6, where he makes these discoveries related to Saturn. And then in summer of 1655, he goes to Paris briefly for the first time, and loves it, and is sort of fated there by mathematicians and astronomers. And he eventually moves there from the 1660s all the way through to about 1681, and except for a couple of brief withdrawals to The Hague, he lives there, and he has a job through his connections through the salons of Paris with mathematicians and scientists there. He is appointed by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, Louis XIV's minister, his sort of all-powerful minister of everything, as in effect, the sort of guiding light of what will become the French Academy of Sciences. And the fact that he's Dutch seems to be no obstacle to this, and in fact may even be something of an advantage, because he's perceived as a practical man. He's not a sort of airy philosopher like some of the Parisian salons had a reputation for. He wanted to solve actual problems and had the wherewithal to do it. And so he formed the sort of early program of work for the French Academy of Sciences, listing the sorts of questions that they should be devoting their attention to, which unsurprisingly revolved around astronomical observations and better clocks, and as well as theories of light and sort of fundamental matters such as the size of the Earth and distance of the planets and problems like this. So he then becomes part of a different network, if you like, of French scientists, and also in correspondence and occasional meeting with English ones as well. The French Colbert, with Louis XIV's funding, is trying to get the French Academy going. At the same time, what will become the Royal Society in London is taking shape. And these two bodies, sort of in formation, are looking at each other across the channel with envious eyes and trying to definitely with envious eyes, because they both think the other one's much better funded by the royal family than the other, and as well as having different scientists and different skills. And Huygens is able to travel between these two bodies. He goes to London in the 1660s, early 1660s, and becomes the first foreign fellow of the Royal Society. And he collaborates on seagoing, ideally seagoing clock designs with British scientists there. And these clocks are trialed on voyages by English ships, long voyages where you test the clock's performance over the duration of the journey as it travels through many degrees of latitude and longitude. They didn't obviously solve the problem, because we know that in the following century, John Harrison devised the seagoing chronometer that did finally work at sea. It was practical, but they made some progress. So Huygens also had his dispute with Hooke, and he met with Newton. Newton was one of the very few people that, Huygens was one of the very few people that Newton valued his opinion. So he did, they did compare notes about ideas of force and to some extent light as well at that time, and Newton was grateful for his input. So that was a sort of constructive, not quite a partnership, but a sort of just a glancing encounter. The English were very busy developing a thing called the air pump, which was based on generating a vacuum. So it was newly realized that if you had an efficient enough pump, you could create this thing called a vacuum inside a glass vessel. And there was puzzlement as to what the nature of the vacuum was. Was it truly nothing in there? Was the ether still in there, or was there literally nothing? And this was sort of bound up with questions of religious belief, because if you believe that God is everywhere and you've suddenly created a glass vessel with nothing in it, is God there too? Or was it a space for the devil? And people like Thomas Hobbes were worried that if a genuine vacuum would create space for the devil. Anyway, Huygens became involved in these experiments in London on the air pump. He went back home to Paris and worked to improve the air pump and tried to, or succeeded in improving it, corresponded with Robert Boyle and people in London about his improvements. They were skeptical, they couldn't repeat what he'd done despite him describing what he'd done. And it was only when he actually physically was over in London again and on hand, hands-on with the experimental kit, that they were able to emulate the improvement that he'd made in Paris. So that's an example of how science needed both the transfer of ideas through letters and correspondence, but also something much more physical, where these experiments were so finely calibrated that sometimes you couldn't describe them in sufficient accuracy that someone could replicate them. And the idea of replicating experiments was becoming recognized as something that it was very important to be able to do if your results were to be valid. So that's...
Could I ask, you've mentioned a lot of familiar names of the history of science or natural philosophy at the time. Hooke, Boyle, even Newton. He knew all these people. And yet, as you say in your book, Huygens has kind of been eclipsed in history of science. Why is he not remembered in the same way as these other people from his own time?
I don't know, really. I mean, part of it is probably to do with Newton and the sort of cult of Newton that arose. Newton was very keen on this cult. He started it off, and he did his best not to credit others whose work he actually depended on. So people like Hooke were cut out of legitimate mention in his work, and so was Huygens to some extent. And so Newton, was not good at acknowledging others, and obviously we now acknowledge Newton as the greatest scientist of that period. Huygens was the senior man, at least, and early on in their relationship, Newton depended on Huygens for his connection. And I should just say that Huygens' brother, by this time in 1680s, after the Glorious Revolution, Huygens' older brother Constantine is the secretary, continuing his father's tradition, to William III in London. And Newton wants a particular position, and so he asks via Christiaan and Constantine for an audience with the king to see if he can get this position. So there Newton's the junior partner. But Newton became a cult, and he was in England first, and then in France, thanks to Voltaire and Émile du Châtelet, translating his work, and sort of swamped all others. And so suddenly there's no significant science in this field between Galileo, who has his own sort of mythological story, and Newton. And as I say, this cult just grew and grew until Einstein came along, really.
So if you were to bolster the cult of Huygens, what would you say is his most lasting contribution?
I don't want to single one out, because I think it's the range. I think it's the way astronomy and physics and mathematics and geometry and a visual sense, which may then connect with the art of the Dutch Golden Age. It's the way all those combine in his mind that I think is key to his work.
Are we ready to take questions from the audience, Hugh? Is that all right?
Good for me, yeah.
All right, well, then I would invite people to post their questions in the chat, and then I will ask them on your behalf. In the meantime, while we're waiting for you to post your questions, you mentioned, this is a time when there's a lot of curiosity about why things happen the way they do, right? Like those Dutch tears, why do they shatter when you hit the weak end, but not the strong end? The vacuum, is God there or not? How does this is also a time of religious wars, right?
Yeah. And trade wars and
lots
so
of
on.
lots of war going on. So, what is the role of religion and philosophy and ethics and these sorts of things in Huygens' time and maybe also in his work?
It's problematic, I suppose. These scientists try to carry on their scientific lives across international borders, occasionally with difficulty, occasionally with great difficulty. So, for example, the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society, Henry Oldenburg, who was one of these sort of deal makers between scientists across borders, and he was instrumental in getting Newton and Leibniz and Huygens and others to talk, even though they're all in different countries. And occasionally he would step in and defuse a nasty argument that was brewing up between these people. He was accused of spying by the English government and briefly thrown into the Tower of London. And then the sort of equipment that the instruments that these people were sending to each other would puzzle military guards who'd be opening packages and probably be destroyed en route because they didn't understand what they were and thought they might be militarily significant. The scientists became one of the ways they communicated important scientific information, important in their community, was by anagram. So you'd write an anagram of what you discovered and not tell people what the anagram decoded as until you were ready to, but you could use the date of the original anagram to say, yes, but I had this discovery way back then. And so this kind of correspondence obviously looked extremely similar to coded letters. So that raises another problem. And these countries were mutually at war with each other, for long periods of all this period, the overall period of Huygens' professional life. So there were 3 Anglo-Dutch wars at sea. There was the Rampjaar and the French invasion of Holland, and various other things too. I mean, the English joined in the French invasion as well later on. So the 3 countries most important to Christiaan Huygens were attacking each other at the same time as he was trying to do his work in all 3 of them. And in fact, for example, when he was trying to advance the idea of clocks that could be used on ships, this could easily be seen as a development of military interest and significance. And so you see there might be jealousies and rivalries and secrecies involved there. But Huygens managed to sort of carry on his work, and occasionally his test clocks would go aboard English ships or aboard French ships or aboard Dutch ships. They went on all 3 at different times. So he was very pragmatic about how to carry on, and really wasn't interested in the sort of national situation very much.
I suppose his position as a social elite, would have helped him to cross those boundaries easier. But apart from all the conflicts that are going on around him, as a scientist, he's involved in disputes as well with fellow thinkers. So we have a question from the audience, for example, about, I believe, Italian astronomer Cassini. He had a dispute with Cassini.
Yes. I don't know much about that one, I'm afraid. That's later on. Cassini becomes the director of the Paris Observatory and is a more career astronomer than Huygens ever was. So, Cassini spends many more hours looking through telescopes than Huygens does. And Huygens is a bit upset that when the Paris Observatory is built, it's built essentially, this is Colbert's doing with Louis XIV's patronage, It's built essentially for Cassini. So there was that dispute. I think they probably had disagreements about astronomical issues, which I can't actually remember which ones they had disagreements about. I mean, they had differing opinions about what kinds of telescopes got the best results, and Huygens continued to try and use longer and longer telescopes, and Cassini went another way with that.
Do these, because you've read correspondence between these different natural philosophers or scientists, right? Does it give you an idea of Huygens's personality?
It does, but not a huge amount. I mean, they're very business-like letters, I suppose. They stick to the subject. He doesn't crack jokes or put in sort of social news or whatever. He does to his family. You know, the family letters are very interesting because they, you know, he'll be talking about grinding such and such a lens for a telescope 1 minute, and then he'll be saying, I'm still chasing that wig you ordered from my Paris perruquier. So those letters are all over the place in that sense, and very quick shifts between of tone between the two ideas, and often shifts of language too. So sometimes the astronomical stuff will be in Latin, and then some piece of news like that might be in French because it's kind of, he's in Paris and it's court language and he's worrying about wigs. And then some slightly rude joke might be in Dutch. So that kind of correspondence I find much more lively. The correspondence between scientists about scientific matters seems to focus much more seriously on the science. That may be a product of the way his letters have been historically edited. So my main source was, you know, there are 21 volumes of the Huygens complete correspondence that were compiled between the 1880s and 1950s, an awful long job. And in those, you know, they may have omitted information that seemed trivial to them when doing the editing. So some of that kind of banter that's in the family correspondence may have been lost. I don't know.
We have time for a few more questions here. There's one, somebody's wondering about Spinoza, Dutch philosopher, who was also acquainted with Huygens. Were they acquainted as friends, or did Huygens see Spinoza differently, as just a craftsman to make his lenses for him?
It's very hard to gauge the true nature of their relationship. Spinoza lived for a time, you know, within several hundred meters of the Hofwijck house. So Huygens, you know, had the opportunity to meet him, did meet him, and they also corresponded. The Huygens brothers recognized Spinoza's supreme talent at making, you know, some of the best lenses around, and they did buy lenses from him, obtain them. I don't know how much they paid, but you know, Spinoza was aware of their work or what Huygens was looking at, and so there is that relationship there. But whether they were friends, whether they talked much about philosophical ideas, for example, I don't really know. It seems probably not.
All right, well, we have one last question from the audience, and after that I'll ask one last one as well. Huygens, towards the end of his life, he wrote a work about the possibility of extraterrestrial life. Can you explain how this fits into the thinking of that time? So I know, by the way, I remember I wrote a paper back in my own studies about Giordano Bruno, who lived 100 years earlier, who was also thinking about extraterrestrials and was burnt at the stake for it.
Yes.
By the Catholic Church.
Yeah.
So something's changed in 100 times.
Well,
100 years.
Huygens is in a different place and a different time, and so he needn't fear that. But there is a long lineage of daring to think about extraterrestrial life, if you like, and it dips in terms of its acceptability with other communities, continues to do so, really. So there are classical speculations about extraterrestrial life and medieval ones, and then there's Bruno, and then there's Fontenelle, a French author, who writes a speculation about extraterrestrial life shortly before Huygens's, and this becomes very popular. But Fontenelle is not the astronomer or scientific thinker that Huygens is. And so I think Huygens's speculation, which is a sort of short book length essay about the forms that life might take and where it might live and so on. This is more scientifically informed. And so he talks about the kind of, he doesn't quite go into details of, if the strength of the gravitational field on this planet is such and such, it would make the creatures look like this. But he does talk, he clearly relates the idea of their form and size to factors on those, he's talking about, the planets in the solar system, related to the gravity and the atmosphere and the distance from the sun and the light and so on. So it is a scientifically informed speculation, but nonetheless he has sort of bonkers ideas that says, he can't believe they would have telescopes as good as we have, simply because he's proud of his own telescopes. But he recognizes they would want to know about astronomy, and so they must have sort of special powers of eyesight. So there are kind of crazy ideas like that, and about their sort of social habits and whether they'd have music and probably how they dress and so on. I can't remember exactly what's in there. Certainly about size and shape.
So interesting divergence from modern science fiction, which thinks of aliens as having incredibly advanced technology, being way beyond us, and he thinks that they couldn't even build a telescope like his.
Yeah, perhaps.
Okay, I'd like to ask you one more question. You've talked to us about Huygens' inventions, his background, his education, how he's involved with not just science, but also arts and music. And I'm really curious for us as a University of Technology nowadays, and we're educating engineers and designers, etc. Would you say that there's a strong parallel between Huygens and the way he went about his work and engineers and scientists today?
I think there is, yes. You have to sort of bear in mind a couple of caveats. One, that professional occupations of this sort didn't really exist then, and the idea of being a 40 hours a week sort of a paid scientist or engineer didn't really exist. So Huygens, needed instead he needed patronage, and he was lucky that A, he had his father's connections, and B, he got this job in effect in Paris as the sort of central scientific figure of the French government, in effect, as we put it now. So that is that's an important difference. But also he still remained a generalist. We've seen the range of crazy problems that he's tackled, and an engineer these days, they'd have a lively mind, but their job would probably require them to focus much more tightly on things, and stick to their knitting, as it were, and just do the job they're paid to do. So it feels much more constraining now as disciplines have grown and become more channeled into different specialisms.
It certainly wouldn't hurt to dabble in the arts and the literature, etc. on the side, though.
A lot of scientists secretly do, but they don't.
Secretly.
Yes, yeah.
All right, well, thank you. Hugh, I want to thank you for your time with us today. We have run out of time. Again, this has been recorded. Hopefully we'll be able to put it online in a week or two. Again, it's the book Dutch Light by Hugh Aldersey-Williams. I've read it with much pleasure. There's also a translation in Dutch, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, that is. Yes, it's called an eeuw van licht in Dutch.
Een eeuw van licht. Okay, well, I recommend if you want to know more about Huygens, definitely invest in this book. I want to thank everybody else for joining us today. Thank you for your questions as well, and hope to see you next time. You can check out the rest of our program at sg.tudelft.nl. Thank you again, Hugh.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, class. Bye.
Goodbye.